go.
And they don't actually. A meeting which is one of the fish.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Welcome to our afternoon session. We're really excited to have our Sea Grant agent here, Katie Rose, a real favorite of yours, and I hope she's one of mine. That joke. She's the Florida Sea Grant Extension agent. She completed her first open water dive in Key Largo. She spent 6 years in Gainesville. She's got a bachelor's and a master's from the University of Florida. She's an expert in sponge restoration, finfish, crustaceans, fisheries management, and submerged vegetation. Let me hand it over to Katie Rose. Put your hands together, folks.
Thanks, y'all. Yes, so submerged aquatic vegetation, I'm glad I put that last in my bio because that is what I will be talking a little bit about here today. So some of you might be familiar, I see a lot of familiar faces in the room. We get including some Eyes on Seagrass swag, a citizen science seagrass monitoring program that I run. But given the topic of this course, I also wanted to give a really thorough overview as to why we have that program running in Charlotte Harbor and the history of seagrass and macroalgae, which have this really interesting relationship with one another in Charlotte Harbor. So, that being said, I always like to give a little introduction as to who quite I am and who I work for. So I am your Florida Sea Grant Extension agent for Charlotte County. How many people are familiar with the extension of the land grant university system? Oh, actually quite a few hands. Excited, great. So Florida Sea Grant and the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences are a part of the land grant university system, which was established in 1862 actually by Abraham Lincoln because he realized that there was a lot of research, specifically agricultural research, that was being done at the universities but wasn't making its way down to the end users, which was really important because at the time the end users were the farmers who were feeding the country. So he set up the land grant university system to basically bridge that gap and make sure that the research was reaching the end users. So in the state of Florida, so there's one university per state that is designated as the land grant university system. And in Florida, you can imagine that is the University of Florida, and specifically within that, the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, or IFAS. In 1975, but I think 1966 was when these conversations started happening. Somebody said that, hey, maybe we should do the same thing for our aquatic resources. I often make the joke because, as we all know, the ocean didn't exist until 1966. And so NOAA took on that role specifically for our marine and our aquatic resources. And so Sea Grant is a college program, and it sits under NOAA, and there's 35 programs in the coastal states, the Great Lakes states, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And within the state of Florida, the way that these organizations interact is there is an extension office in every county in this state. There's not necessarily a Sea Grant agent in every county. You can imagine some of them don't require it, but even some of the coastal counties don't have Sea Grant agents. So, but because of that unique relationship, I am your Florida Sea Grant Extension agent for Charlotte County. That being said, I have a lot of bosses. Because I work for the University of Florida, I have to display this slide every time I give a presentation that says we're not going to discriminate against anybody for any reason, and if for some reason you'd like to make a complaint throughout the course of this presentation, I could give you the information on how to do that. But now on to the fun stuff. Seagrass and submerged aquatic vegetation. You guys are probably here because you believe in, right, the intrinsic value of our aquatic resources and that they should exist because they have the right to exist. Unfortunately, that doesn't always translate to the real world. So when we get into seagrass, and specifically talking about why we're so focused on it, I often reference the ecosystem services that are provided by our seagrass beds and why we are concerned with it. So on top of just existing because we think it's beautiful, it protects our coasts because that root system that the seagrass beds have. When you look out over a seagrass meadow, what you're not seeing is literally feet, meters of root systems that exist below it that are stabilizing sediment. Seagrass over time, I think there's another one up here that says improved water quality, stabilization of sediments, here we go. So over time, as sediment moves through the seagrass meadows, the swaying of the seagrass dampens that wave energy and causes the sediment to sort of fall down by the roots. And these seagrass beds are so old that over time, ancient seagrass beds have gotten buried and then new seagrass has grown on top of it. So if you were to take a sediment core in a seagrass field, in a seagrass meadow, you would get, like I said, feet and meters of dead seagrass, and particularly of that root system that locks all that sediment down. I mentioned improved water quality, so in addition to improving water clarity and pulling sediment out of the water, it also pulls nutrients out of the water because it is a plant, right? Plants need the same nutrients that we do. It's the reason we put, or not the exact same ones, but the reason we put fertilizer on our lawns. They, rather than taking those nutrients from fertilizer, pull it out of the water column. They also sequester carbon and as a result, have a really big impact on climate regulation. When they're pulling out of those sort of microscopic nutrients and other things out of the environment, they're also pulling down and out pathogens, as well as compounds that dedicate themselves to ocean acidification. So they're helping to regulate all these processes. And on top of that, probably the reason how many of us here fish in the river? I knew Mark was gonna put his hands up. Yeah, so 70% of our fishery species in Florida are dependent on seagrass beds at some point in their lifetime. It's a really vital nursery habitat because otherwise in a seagrass meadow, there's no features, right? So I always say that myself or anybody in this room standing in a forest is the equivalent of a tiny baby blue crab hanging out in a seagrass meadow, right? It's providing structure and nooks and crannies to hide and nooks and crannies for your food items to hide. So a really, really important resource. And unfortunately, it's not doing too hot. In 2009, there was this really big meta study done, very thorough, where one scientist took data from every seagrass study that he could find and found that we are losing our global seagrass coverage at a rate of roughly 7% per year. Pretty incredible. And what is contributing to these declines? Coastal development, as you can imagine, not only physically ripping up the seagrass for navigation or to make docks, but also the nutrient inputs that result from that and removing of the wetlands and the filtration system. Physical damage by boat propellers, destructive fishing practices such as trawling and mooring, physically dragging nets along the bottom and ripping up the seagrass, pollution and poor sewage treatment, which sort of ties in with our coastal development. They can be buried by sediment or nutrient runoff, and I'll touch on this a little bit later in the presentation, but is everybody here for Ian? Who is here for Ian? Yeah, almost everybody. Right, so we saw how dirty and dark that water got, and seagrass is a plant. So when it gets buried up physically by sediment or its life gets blocked out, that's a really huge issue for it. And then of course, sort of an overarching, less localized effect is the effects of climate change. Much the way you like to be a specific temperature, seagrass does as well. So as the ocean continues to get hotter and more acidic, it becomes stressed, and there's actually a fair amount of seagrass diseases as well that are affecting it. So, bleak, I'm sorry. But the good news is for a little while, because of all of the land that is preserved in the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves system, for a long time, we were doing pretty good with our seagrass loss. You can see this graph that I grabbed from the CHNEP Water Atlas. Have you guys had any, everybody know what CHNEP is? Have you guys had speakers from them yet? the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership. So Sea Grant, Hello Me, is to NOAA, as the National Estuary Program is to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So they're a really big presence in this area. And they have this great resource called the Water Atlas, where they pull all the data that they can, not only data that they collect, but also, I can't even name all of their sources, the South Florida Water Management District, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and they try to pull it in and make it accessible to everybody. So I pulled this graph from that resource, and I believe this data is collected by the Southwest Florida Water Management District, or SWFMUD, as you guys might hear me say. You'll have to forgive me if I repeat things that you guys have already known. You just knock me on the head if I do so. Be like, we already got this. But because of all of our preserved shoreline down here, you can see, I mean, we have a few little ups and downs, but this is probably considered a background noise kind of loss. Nothing that was overly concerning between 1982 and 2018. And then we get to 2021, right? Everybody might have been familiar with this headline from 2022. We have thousands of acres of seagrass gone in Charlotte Harbor. The east wall was probably the most drastically affected, losing 50% of its seagrass coverage. On average, Lemon Bay and Charlotte Harbor lost about 23% of its coverage. That's almost a quarter. And you could see that drop off from this paper here, which I'll touch a little bit more on the causes of the seagrass loss that are discussed in that paper. So what's going on? All right, I'm just going to click through all of this since my animations didn't quite pop up the way I wanted to. So what's going on? We have a presence of macroalgae or seaweed, you know, that gross stuff that you're touching when you're swimming that you don't really want to touch. Specifically, a lot of green filamentous algae. Some scientists refer to it as GFA. And anybody who fishes, you know, might know this as snotgrass when it starts to degrade and you cast your line and you pull it through the seagrass beds. Because seagrass beds are so great to target for fishing, you pull this stuff up and it's goopy, and if it's decomposing, it smells bad. But basically, we have had a real presence of this stuff in our harbor since around 2012 is when we first started seeing it. So this graph right here is from our local FWC Fisheries Independent Monitoring Lab. You know, they go out and they do constant surveys, and around 2012, they pull these big nets behind the boat and do trawls and seines because they're trying to basically tally the fish, right, and get some information on the population. And in 2012 is when they started seeing so much algae that they were like, we should probably start writing this down. So you can see over time in this green, so we had a little blip sort of early in the aughts, and 2012 is when you really start seeing the kick off of that algae in the harbor. And originally, the boom sort of started along the west wall, and you can, as you can imagine, eventually made their way over to the east wall, which is what caused that really drastic seagrass loss in 2020. Another example here. So this is a joint monitoring effort that is between Sea Grant, myself, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, FWC, and the Southwest Florida Water Management District, SWFMUD. We go out and we do these like visual surveys of the amount of algae. We do it in the winter because that is when the water is clearest. And so this is just for 2022. I think it gives, I wanted to go through the keys because I'm going to show you a time series soon and everything is about to get a lot smaller. So the color is indicative of the type of algae. So green, we talked about that green filamentous algae. You can see a lot of that here along the east wall. Whereas if we move to the opposite end of the spectrum with yellow in the middle representing sort of a mix of different algae species into red algae. And that's more like, I guess you could say it's more branchy. It provides a little bit more structure. And typically in a system, there's always going to be a little bit of algae, despite the fact that we talk about it being, you know, the worst thing ever. We do want a little bit because it does provide, particularly those reds, provide habitat and structure and food and sources to pull the nutrients out of the water column. But obviously we are seeing quite a bit of it. And then of course the size of the circles here depend on the coverage. You can see we've got a lot of big circles here, and the smaller the circle, sort of the less coverage there is in a site that we surveyed. Before I get into the time series, this also gives me a really interesting opportunity. I think 2022 is the best example of it, is to talk about why we seem to see so much green algae up here and sort of down in Matlacha Pass, but in the middle we get more mixes of red algae. Does anybody have any thoughts as to why that might be?
Tidal flow?
Exactly. So if I were to extend this map, Boca Grande Pass is right over here. So something, and scientists haven't quite figured out the chemistry of that interaction, but the general thought is because there's more tidal exchange and potentially some different nutrient dynamics going on here, that is what creates that hotspot for specifically the red algae, as opposed to the green algae where there's a little bit less flow up here in the harbor and down in Matlacha Pass as well. Does that make sense? Excellent. Okay, so now I'm gonna get into the time series and everything's about to shrink up, but I wanted to make sure everybody could see the key first. So, and then I have the key here. So we have been doing these surveys ever since 2020. And you can see, I mean, it's been pretty intense, right? Something that is probably worth noting is our relatively small circles, our relatively green algae surveys in the months reported immediately post-EM. Right, we talked about briefly about all that sediment coming down, and what that sediment was carried on was literally billions with a B gallons of water, right? And there was a lot of force behind that. So the sort of working theory among the scientists is basically that either that algae was buried by that sediment by the same way that the seagrass could be buried, because it also requires light, or the sheer force of the water flushing out quite literally just flushed it out into the Gulf. So we saw this sort of temporary relief, and unfortunately it seems as though we're kind of back in full force. Sorry, I'm gonna take a sip of water. Can I move these over here? You guys won't be bothered by that before I move on to my next slide. And so I know this is a busy figure. I promise I'm gonna break it down and explain it. So I mentioned that paper that showed you that grass drop off of the seagrass. I'm sorry, I'm gonna do it this way. Of the initial drop off of that seagrass, and it was called the hangover effect. And that hangover effect is specifically referring to Hurricane Irma. And a lot of the work on that paper was loosely based on this paper, which came in 2019, just a little bit earlier. So I want to focus here specifically on these middle ones, on the wet season, because this sort of best illustrates the flow of the harbor. So basically in this study, what scientists did is they put sort of radioisotopes of dye in the water. It wasn't dye, it's not bad for the environment, it's not the equivalent of dumping pollutions, it's existing elements, and basically what they've done is they just alter them a little bit so that they can pick them up with a satellite. So they just fluoresce a little differently under different sensors. And so they took a bunch of this stuff, and you can see they started dumping it a little bit in the tidal piece, and they also did the same thing in the Caloosahatchee. And then they just watched it to see where it all went. And so at the top here, we have that initial, and as we move down, you can see the flow. So some of you guys might be familiar with the fact that the tidal piece, when water comes out of the Peace River, you think maybe perhaps it would go down the east wall because it's on the east sort of side of the harbor when you're looking at it, when in fact it actually sort of shoots out and comes down the west wall. The Caloosahatchee, on the other hand, a lot of people think of our systems as very separate, which I have never quite understood. Even the districts that we are in for water monitoring are different. So we here in Charlotte Harbor are in the territory of the Southwest Florida Water Management District, whereas the Caloosahatchee lives in the South Florida Water Management District. So you can see that those systems are being articulated as though they're very different. But you can see from this figure that, given enough time, only 20 days, so that's 3 weeks, that water, particularly in the wet season, when there's so much rain, is moving up, of course, in the areas that you expect it, in the Matlacha Pass and Pine Island Sound, but also up the east wall of the harbor. And this hangover effect that the scientists believe might have been responsible for that accumulation of algae on the east wall, as well as the subsequent seagrass loss, was a result of the red tide and the blue-green algae bloom in 2017 and 2018. Basically, so there was a couple of steps. It wasn't the algae itself, but basically what happened is those two blooms together killed a lot of fish, right? Who was here for that? Yeah, a lot of hands. You guys remember, right? Hearing about, the smells and the dead fish and it was terrible. And seeing eyes rolling, it was terrible to remember. And so what scientists think might have happened based on the flow of this isn't necessarily that the blue-green algae got up into here, or that that something came down from the Peace River, but that those two blooms collectively killed a lot of fish. And when those fish decompose, they made a lot of bioavailable nutrients for the algae, which accumulated along the east wall. And so that's what they're thinking, so it's not necessarily a direct relationship, but that's why we saw that's why they call it the hangover effect, is it took some time. So first the algae blooms killed the fish, those fish eventually broke down, and then those nutrients got pinned up specifically against the east wall and caused sort of those really prolific algae blooms. Yes. So this is another thing that we're contending with. So there's that hangover effect, but there's also the overarching principle of seagrass versus macroalgae. They're kind of pitted against each other, like I suggested. So seagrass is a very typical flowering plant. It's much like the plants in your garden or the plants that you keep in your home. It just has a few adaptations to survive underwater. Macroalgae, on the other hand, doesn't have that same sort of vascular structure. So if my physical body were a seagrass, I am absorbing nutrients, or any sort of regular plant, quote unquote regular, the plants that people are probably the most familiar with. I am absorbing nutrients through my roots, through my feet, in the soil. If I'm a macroalgae, because I don't have veins and a whole system to carry nutrients around my body, I've gotten really good, and I can absorb nutrients through my skin. So you think about the surface area, right? And that's why when we get into these systems that have increasing nutrients or even too many nutrients, that macroalgae or seaweed starts to dominate. It's just so much more efficient at taking up those nutrients than seagrass is. So seagrass needs a ton of light, and it does need some nutrients. Nutrients, we talk about it as sort of the bad guy these days. Nature needs a little bit of everything. It's all about a sliding scale. So you can see in this figure here that we've got optimal light to nutrients, and that is, connected to a system that isn't super developed. There's a lot of natural habitat still left in place for that natural filtration of water that's making its way into sort of your major water body. When we start to develop a little bit more, we remove those natural filtration services that a lot of wetlands provide. We put in a lot of impermeable surfaces, so our water is running straight off with minimal opportunity for nature to do its thing and take sort of all of the nutrients out of that water before it gets into that major water body. And what happens then is, because there's so much nutrients in the system, the algae is just so much more efficient at taking it up, and it absorbs it almost instantaneously. In fact, one of the issues that we have had in Charlotte Harbor is, I spent the morning with Brandon Moody, who I believe presented on the first day with y'all, right? And one of the issues that I have been chatting about with him is the fact that it's really hard for him to articulate to people that we have a nutrient problem. And that's because they're saying that because they're looking at the water and saying, there's not that much nutrients in the water. And that's because it's all in the algae. The algae will suck that up almost immediately. So the presence of algae is an indicator that we're headed towards a system that has too many nutrients in it. And then of course you get into a system where, we're just totally overloaded on nutrients, and that not only physically blocks the light just because there's like dirt and other crud getting into the water, but also, so you think a macroalgae is efficient. Does everybody remember, your surface area to volume ratio conversation from school? So a few nods, a few nods. So in general, things that are smaller have more surface area compared to their volume. Does that make sense? I don't know. Does that? Basically, the way I was talking about how macroalgae are so much more efficient because they have more surface area to absorb nutrients, microalgae, your harmful algal blooms, your red tide, your cyanobacteria blooms, your blue-green algae, those guys are even way more efficient than the macroalgae. So when you start introducing so many nutrients in there, then you shift from a system where you not only lost a bit of seagrass, you're starting to see the presence of macroalgae, but you're almost exclusively seeing macroalgae, and you start to see microalgae as well, those little unicellular bits. Based on this graph, I would say Charlotte Harbor's in the middle. We still have some seagrass, but we are starting to see sort of to shift to a macroalgae dominated system. And by the way, we do, despite the fact that we can have a conversation about development and density all day long, there is still a fair amount of preserved shoreline because of the aquatic preserve system. A really good example of this system that has totally collapsed and lost all of its seagrass is probably Indian River Lagoon, right? So they're microalgae dominated. Everybody's been hearing about the fact that, they had to feed all the manatees over there romaine lettuce, right? Mm-hmm. And now apparently they're having to teach them the opposite because they expect the romaine, and they're trying to say, hey guys, no, you can't become dependent on us. So now they're going the opposite way. We're spending a lot of effort trying to execute processes that nature was already doing for us. Oh God, sorry, my animations didn't work, so I'm just gonna click through everything and then talk through it. So the reason that we know all of this and have been able to document it is because of monitoring efforts. And as our seagrass habitats continue to decline, monitoring is going to be even more important. Not just because it will document the changes, but also because, we hear a lot of talk about seagrass restoration and why don't we just plant it and put it back. You can't just plant stuff and then walk away from it because you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know if it's going to work, and you want to make sure that you're developing something that's really effective, right? Particularly when you're talking about putting stuff in a system that's nutrient dense. Like let's say you put a bunch of seagrass in a system and it dies. There's already too many nutrients in that system, and you just added a bunch more because that seagrass is going to die and it's going to decompose, but it's not going to offer those same ecosystem services if it doesn't live there. So there's a lot of people monitoring seagrass because, as I mentioned, it's super important. So I mentioned Swiftmud a couple times. They monitor seagrass every 2 to 3 years, sort of the overall coverage, and map it out. And they do that actually via plane, via flyover. So they can do it visually by looking down, but they also have all of these sensors that are very specific and tuned to a frequency of light that seagrasses put off. And that is what generates, oh God. Sorry, team. So for example, this came from the CHNEP Water Atlas, but this is how we generate these kinds of maps. So we could see like the coverage expanding in and out. As you can imagine, flying over something is not the same as getting in and looking at it. So the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and specifically in this area, that's the office of the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Reserves, has been getting in the water to ground truth that data since 1998. And these are all of their various sites where they are doing that. And the other thing that the Swiftmud has a really difficult time with is documenting algae. because it looks very similar to seagrass, particularly from those sensors and from high above. And on top of that, so seagrass is bolted into the ground, right? That's why it has all those sediment stabilizing processes. Algae, I mean, they call it drift algae. So you can imagine from a scientist's perspective how hard that is to quantify when you're doing these large scale flyovers. I actually think they're doing one right now. As in science, the data always lags a little bit, right? Because they have to quality check it and make sure that everything is good. But did I mention they go specifically during the winter? Again, because the water is clear. Yeah, even though that doesn't necessarily line up with peak seagrass growth time. We'll talk about that when we get into eyes on seagrass.
Or a year like this year, when we get a lot of rain and clarity's not there.
Exactly. I think they've been having a really hard time actually this year because we've been getting so much rain. Did everybody hear what Dan said? We're talking about our weird rain events. We're getting even more flushing. So I think they've been having a hard time actually getting out there. And of course, you can't go on a cloudy day, right? Because then your sensors don't pick up anything. As far as monitoring algae, I mentioned those collaborative surveys between what feels like every agency in the region that started going out just in 2019 or 2020 to start like visually looking at that algae the same way they do for the seagrass, putting their eyes on it. You'll notice that Eyes on Seagrass does both, and that is actually sort of how it came to be. So Eyes on Seagrass, it is as I mentioned before, it's a citizen science seagrass monitoring program. So my predecessor, some of you may or may not know Betty Stogler, started the program in 2019 when she, through her connections to the scientific community and also through her connections to local community stakeholders, was starting to see all this algae and recognized it was becoming an issue. And as we've discussed, science often lags. It's hard for science because it's such a thorough process to address immediate issues. So what Betty did was take the seagrass survey methods that are used, those on-the-ground methods that are used by, the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves office, and she adapted it just slightly so that she could train citizens on how to do it and to make it more accessible to them. So, and by the way, she did this with the help of of course, the Aquatic Preserves office, but also some seagrass biologists at the University of Florida. So it's very scientific based, even though it's still more accessible. So the things that we look at in Eyes on Seagrass, we'll look at depth, which I'm going to go through all these methods later and we're going to play around and it'll be fun. The depth of water, the sediment type, algae cover, seagrass cover. The species of seagrass are there because that can give us an indication of shifting species. There are some species that exist in more stressed habitats, so that can give us even an earlier warning that the seagrass isn't doing well before it entirely disappears. Canopy height, so that's basically the seagrass height. Secchi depth, water clarity. I heard you guys got to play with those on, oh my god, 2 weeks ago. I keep wanting to say Monday. 2 weeks ago, yes. So, and the reason I bolded algae biomass and taking an algae sample is that this is where our program differs from existing monitoring efforts. So, we have a focus on not only seagrass coverage, but that algae as well. Oh goodness. Again, sorry team, I'm just gonna click all the way through this. Boom. Okay, so talking a little bit about the different methods and where our methods diverge from, the well-established state methods used by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. So as I said, they established theirs in, I think that's just in 1998 actually. But Eyes on Seagrass, we use quote-unquote random transects. So our sampling system is based off of the same one that the fisheries, the FWC Fisheries Independent Monitoring Program uses. And there's a randomness incorporated into that. Whereas the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Reserves, they go to the same spot every year. We use a 1/2 meter by a 1/2 meter quadrat, which for those of you, I'm gonna go through the methods in a second. But this is our sampling window. It basically introduces an element of control rather than letting citizen scientists go out and say, just go look at seagrass wherever you want, right? Because that would be really hard for us scientists to quantify. you say, oh, look, a manatee, I'm gonna look at seagrass here, and oh, maybe I'll go play along the shoreline over there. It becomes very difficult to quantify. So this is our 1/2 meter quadrat that we use to sort of set down on the ground and, look at seagrass within that boundary. So this is a 1/2 meter, right here, this size. The aquatic preserves, they use a whole meter. It's ginormous. We use, because, the other thing that the aquatic preserves does is because they are ground truthing that coverage data, they go from the shallow end of the seagrass bed to the deep end, which I've heard of them, 600 meters, which is 1,000 feet, which is a lot. That's about 1/2 mile, where they're putting that putting this square down, or an even bigger one, every so often and assessing. So really long, grueling days. We decided that wasn't entirely accessible for our citizen scientists. So we just do a 50-meter transect, which 50 meters, 150 feet, 1/2 a football field, for those of you who are curious. And we'll put those down, the quadrat down at regular intervals. And the other thing is that we look at algae, not only coverage within our window, but also we take a biomass. So one of the shortcomings of our algae samples that is, taken with all those groups, and we're looking and we're assessing the coverage, you could say, hey, there's 100% coverage here. But if that algae is 3 feet deep, which it can be in parts of the harbor, I've seen it, it's kind of horrifying. That's much different than if your algae is 2 inches deep, right? That gives an indication as to how the system is doing. So we actually weigh it, whereas the aquatic reserves just looks at coverage. And perhaps the most important difference between the two is the time of year that we go out. So Eyes on Seagrass, we do a sample in April and a sample in July, which correspond to sort of the trough and the peaks of algae growth. So that algae will start to grow once the waters get warm in the summer. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection will go when seagrass growth is at its peak, and that tends to be sort of, by my picture here, late fall, early summer. So in that way, our program is really supplementing the existing data and can be integrated to sort of better tell the story of what's going on between seagrass and macroalgae in the area. Betty always used to joke that Eyes on Algae was not a sexy program name. So we'll go through the methods here in a second. We've seen a lot of really great success with the program. We ask our volunteers, I have some equipment here that I will go through, so we give them the equipment to conduct the surveys, but we do ask them to provide their own masks, fins, and snorkels, and also transportation to their sites. So we do have a lot of people that rely on boats or kayaks to get out into the harbor. And then in those months where we sample, everybody's given 2 weeks to visit as many sites as we want. We try to get as much coverage as we can. But that way people aren't confined to saying, for us to say, you must sample this day on Saturday, and oh darn, I can't make it, I have a birthday party. So you're given sort of 2 weeks to sample at your leisure. And we've seen a lot of really great success with the program. So we have been able to sample 45 sites in Charlotte Harbor and Lemon Bay for 4 years. So every year since 2019, save 2020 COVID. That's close to 2,000 of these squares that we've laid down. Our volunteer time and resources are valued at over $110,000. So not only the time that they're dedicating, but also the fact that people are using their own boats. Some of them even leverage their own equipment when they get out there and they, want to make adjustments based on what works best for them in the field. And this is no small feat when you consider the cost of restoration projects as well as monitoring. Monitoring in a restoration project is often the thing that is the most cost inhibitive when you're conducting a restoration project. It's not the cost of buying the seagrass and planting the seagrass. It's that if you have to monitor for 3 years after the fact, you do 3 years times a staff of 5 times an hourly rate, all of a sudden that becomes really expensive. So what have our volunteers been seeing? This is actual volunteer data. One thing I do want to caveat is that we've only been collecting since 2019. State agencies really like to operate not on short-term data, but on trends. That being said, this is data that I showed the volunteers and have showed at a couple of scientific meetings as well to sort of demonstrate the fact that our trends are consistent with what the scientists have been seeing, as well as to just get everybody excited about this program. So, I'm gonna break down this color scheme. So our cooler colors here are the east wall. And when I say east 1, 2, and 3, the top of this map, this is our sampling map here, east 1, the lower the number, the more north. So you'll move down. The warmer colors are the west wall, in which I included sort of the Peace and the Mayaka in that as well, because we talked about the fact that the Peace, comes out and goes along the west wall. And the first thing you're probably thinking is, it's going up and down a lot. And that is because seagrass actually has a seasonal aspect to it. So much the way I talked about, we go out in April and July, which corresponds to less algae and more algae, respectively, just the season in which it grows. The same thing goes for seagrass. So this sort of up and down effect that you're seeing is to be expected. Probably the biggest takeaway, however, though, in Charlotte Harbor, is that you could see, even though it's still going up and down, it is trending downwards. In Lemon Bay, we saw a very similar trend, although for a little while, Lemon Bay, particularly South Lemon Bay, was holding out a little bit for our volunteers, but still, sort of that consistent up and down. Algae gets a little wonky. And this is a great example of why it's really hard for scientists to quantify drift algae, right? Because even our results are fairly inconsistent. But again, you see that when we go out in the springtime here, the algae is less than it is in the summer when it goes up. I guess you could say there's maybe a slight upward trend here, but altogether, sort of level and kind of crazy. Lemon Bay, on the other hand, has a sort of a more consistent, I would say, upward trajectory, but still that seasonal variability. Okay, I feel like I whizzed through seagrass coverage. Does that make sense to everybody? Did anybody see anything in the graphs that they wanted to discuss, or didn't make sense to them the way I interpreted it?
Yeah, how deep can a seagrass grow and still get light?
So in this area, they say 3 to 12 feet. 12 feet tends to be the max. That being said, we try really hard to put our volunteers in 3 to 5, just because we don't need them diving down into 12 feet to do
So
coverage.
without low tide then? Low tide?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think we do mean low, we do that depth based on mean low tide when we pick the sites. So on top of increasing our sampling capacity, the other benefit of this program is that we are creating environmental stewards. So these are pictures from our Eyes on Seagrass. You guys might recognize these folks. From our Eyes on Seagrass Volunteer Appreciation Banquet, in which I talked about the program. I showed them that data that I just showed to you, and we fed everybody because of the value that they contribute to the program. So we had 103 volunteers in 2023, and 91% of them made at least one change to improve conditions for seagrass. And that ranged from a whole host of options to, they looked into using Florida-friendly landscaping, using less fertilizer on their lawn, but also when they were out boating, they were more conscious of where their propeller was and not scraping up that seagrass habitat. And on top of that, we are actually having a scientific impact. So our goal is to connect the data that our citizen scientists collect and actually, use it, because for everybody's sake, we're collecting information that we think people could need. People will get excited about having their data used. So I have presented the data that I just showed to you at the CHNEP Watershed Summit this past summer, as well as the Benthic Ecology Meeting, which is a national meeting that was hosted in Miami this year. I also just submitted an abstract to the International Seagrass Biology Workshop, which is in Naples, Italy this year. So everybody cross your fingers. That would be really cool. And on top of that, I've continued a relationship with those seagrass biologists from the University of Florida that we've been working with, because we'd like to create a database as we expand the program so that people can put information into it wherever they take on the program in the state, and then that database will be publicly accessible information. So, where are we looking going forward? So, the program exists here in Charlotte Harbor, of course, that's what I just talked about. The Sarasota Bay Estuary Program has also taken it on. They've been monitoring seagrass for a long, long time, but adopted our rigorous scientific backed methods in, I believe, 2021. The Tampa Bay Estuary Program, you guys are probably all familiar with the Piney Point spill and that ecological disaster. So eyes on seagrass methods were actually used as a rapid assessment option when they were getting out there to sort of see what the impact of that spill was. And there's actually a big scientific paper published on it using our methods. The program, believe it or not, actually also exists in the Panhandle. Two Sea Grant agents, so there's a version of myself that works in Escambia County, had a similar idea. And up there, rather than a focus on macroalgae, because they don't have so much of a concern with it up there, they take water quality samples and they work with the University of West Florida to get that processed. But we're working right now to sort of bring it all together and make it a big state program. As exhibited by my next little masks, where we have some interest from Sea Grant agents in the Nature Coast to start the program, and I'm also working on eking it into Lee County, because I think it's silly currently that our sampling stops at the county line, particularly when I talked about, right, how the Caloosahatchee water really does sort of impact and get up into our system. I've met with a lot of enthusiasm. We're also working on an e-learning training option to reduce training on the mental load of training for people like myself that actually have to execute the training, but also to sort of help further expand the program and make it more accessible. Like I said, we're working on that automated database so that as the program expands, people can put their data in and create a dashboard where people could potentially get reports, on sort of how the seagrass is doing in various areas of the state. And probably the most important, the one that I'm excited about, is we want to do a study comparing professionally collected data and volunteer collected data. I think Phil this afternoon is going to do a brief talk on the Florida Horseshoe Crab Watch, which is a very similar project, focuses on horseshoe crabs. And the information from that program, they did a study like this, and now FWC uses their data for management and regulatory decisions. So we'd really like to take the program in that direction. And of course, like I mentioned, there's some restoration applications, right? When I say, hey, I have a body of 103 volunteers who are ready to, get out and monitor. And by the way, this could save you $110,000 in a grant that you need to write. And not only, and of course, all of the great benefits of getting everybody engaged, but that's not an insignificant portion of thought that goes into a project. Particularly in the Indian River Lagoon is where we've been trying to eke into that and utilize our volunteers to help mitigate some of the restoration costs. We've also been working with the A Billion Clams project, the Southwest Florida Shellfish Association. You have to forgive me, there's so many acronyms and organizations. We submitted a grant with them this past winter to the Nature Conservancy because they want to use our methods. Hold on, let me reel it back. How many people are familiar with this initiative, the A Billion Clams? So there are I don't know what a cluster of clams is called, like a murder of crows. But basically, there's a whole host of clam farmers clam farming used to be really popular in this region. And now we're sitting here talking about water quality issues and red tide and Ian and Irma. So you can imagine, people who are trying to grow clams that are safe to eat have been hit really hard by that business. And there's this whole host of farmers that has seen this issue and of course are also looking for a way to pivot and continue to have a profitable business and have said, hey, we know how to grow these clams en masse. We've been doing it for years. Can we do it in a restoration capacity? Can we provide the clams for people's restoration projects around the state? So A Billion Clams is one of these efforts of past clam farmers. and they recently got some permits to restore some plots, to plant some clams around seagrass beds in the harbor. And what they would like to do is use eyes on seagrass methods to evaluate the impact that that's having on the nearby seagrass beds. Okay, you guys want to get into it? Okay, so now this is the part where I'm going to transition into like talking about how great my program is. Oh, let me rephrase. Does anybody have any questions about like seagrass in Charlotte Harbor, macroalgae, before we get into sort of what the methods entail and what our volunteers do? I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, I do have one question. When Brandon was here, he gave us a wonderful chart, and what it said was, you know, we lost it on the east wall, we lost it on the Niagara River, we really gained it on the west wall. Why did seagrass grow in the west wall? It was up 27%.
Yes, that is an excellent question, and one I don't have the answer to. But we have noticed those sort of consistent results, right? So we have Phil and the team that did Eyes on Seagrass for us. You guys were on the upper west wall, and then at one point you came down to the southern west wall. You were like, oh, this is way better.
Yeah.
It was heaven. It was heaven.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think on why that might be, but it is a trend that we've been noticing in the data that I can't quite explain. It might be the tidal, the tidal influence, particularly in the south of the harbor and through the Cape Hayes area. My guess it's something to do with nutrient cycling, since algae seems to be a big driver of that seagrass habitat decline. That's my best guess. I know a scientist that says I don't know.
Good, that's good.
Honesty, huh?
Good scientist system.
Did you have a question, Julia?
I have a question.
Bring it on.
When you showed challenges to seagrass,
Mhm.
you showed prop scarring as being one.
Yeah.
We were having a discussion at lunch about like, who can make a decision, what governing body can say pole and troll only in this area? Because there are parts of the state that have that, and it seems like that's an easy win.
Yes.
And I know like captains are for it, because it's going to increase their ability to catch fish and
Yeah.
make a living. So it seems like it's an easy one that most people are in agreement with, but where are we at?
So that has not been my experience, that most people are in agreement with that. There's a lot of recreational fishermen.
Well, they don't count because they don't know.
They count when they vote though, and they
Yeah.
call their commissioners.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've been to like a couple bait shops where, I've had people suggest to me that not only would that not be good because it's annoying to them and they want to be able to, access those parts of the harbor. Pole and troll, yes. But, I mean, I've even had some people suggest that like in some parts of the harbor that like stirring up, like the action of stirring up the water is good for cycling of the nutrients for somehow or another. I'm just playing telephone here. But yeah, so I think there hasn't been a ton of political will. My understanding of the agencies that would be in charge of that, when I think seagrass, I think DEP. So the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and particularly the aquatic preserves. I also imagine that boating, navigation, that's what I'm looking for. I wasn't thinking Coast Guard, I was thinking West Coast Inland Navigational District. Which is like part of Coast Guard. So I imagine there would also be some of that involved as well, but I'm not familiar with those
I'm just trying to
processes.
figure out like who is in charge of that, who can make that rule, because I know Lee County has pole and troll down there.
I believe we have a few pole and troll zones here, but like not a lot. Yeah.
Anyway.
But it is before in Charlotte Harbor, before we started seeing this really drastic like seagrass loss as a whole, prop scars were like the big seagrass issue. Like the aquatic preserves would go out and like take these aerial images, and it was just sad the way you would see it cut up. One of the cool parts about seagrass, and particularly sort of with prop scars, is that seagrass is really resilient. So, and we've seen this in Tampa Bay. So over time, they were encountering the same issues that we were encountering, and through a lot of efforts to improve their water quality, a lot of which was septic to sewer convergence, they were able to actually get their water quality to a point where seagrass coverage started increasing again. I think that was like in the, I'm trying to keep all my facts straight, so you'll have to forgive me if I can't pull it all out of my brain. I believe that was like in the aughts and the 2010s, but it's since sort of started to decrease again. But where that applies to prop scars is that there was a lot of work done specifically around seagrass restoration of prop scars that found out. So one of the issues with prop scars, right, is you create these really big gashes in the bed, and you cut the rhizomes, those root systems in the seagrass beds. And somebody figured out if you take a bunch of burlap and fill it with sand and basically just bring that elevation of sediment back to where it was, that the seagrass will just make its way across it. And eventually that stuff that's in the seagrass will break down. So seagrass is really resilient if we give it a fighting chance. I get a lot of questions about, particularly from our volunteers, they're like, okay, we've done enough looking at it, can we like plant some now? And I always say, planting seagrass is a lot like trying to fix a leak without turning off the faucet. You know, like you're still gonna be planting seagrass in an area where all of these issues still persist. Yeah. Bruce.
You know the prevalence of, you said in the past they looked at the aerial shots of the scarring. Well, you got to have massive seagrass beds to see the scarring.
Yes.
If you've got 3 clumps of grass in a space this big, you're not going to hit it with your prop, chances are. And as far as like the push-pull thing, I would imagine all the boat club people and all these sorts, think about every boat they would rent would have to have a tower on it. You know, if you don't see the seagrass, you don't know when to stop, and you don't, you know, you've got to be elevated. You can't be on just a regular center console boat and know if you're in seagrass or not. And then one other thing about the seagrass, we're taught at the Manatee Park, and this came from FWC, and we've got the great pictures, you know, of the cuts, you know, going through. They say it's 7 to 9 years for that to regenerate. When you make that trough, it takes that long for the seagrass to come back.
Yeah.
If the conditions don't worsen in the meantime.
Yeah. It's slow growing.
Are there is there data that could be put into creating something like a layer in Google Maps or Garmin products so that boaters could see where there's a sea area that's been?
Yeah, it's there. It's
okay.
there if you get the proper. I mean, if you want to pay out the money, there's the Garmin. You can track seabirds. You know, you can watch where every bird is flying. You can see every patch of grass. Shows you densities, everything, so you know right where to go, where to target. And then it projects current, tides, everything, so you know what spot nutrients are going to be concentrated at any given time. You know what's growing on the bottom. You know, you can tell if it's hard bottom, live bottom. So it's already there. It's just you got to have a sophisticated system to buy it. You got to buy that system.
I would also suggest though that, like, I mean, a lot of it is related directly to depth. So you might not even have to invest in specifically knowing what habitat is under you, but just being aware of your depth. Like, you know, the seagrass scars are created by propellers physically cutting into it.
Sure.
Seagrass is pretty resilient, so you know we do a fair amount of tromping on seagrass because we're taking seagrass, and volunteers are always like, "Oh no, we're stepping on it." I'm like, "No, you stepping on it is not going to be the issue. It's, you know, those like really physical deep impacts." So depth, honestly, will do a lot of that work for you. I mean, nobody wants to run aground, right? So what Dave didn't mention in my biography is that you guys can't tell anybody, I'm a Yankee. I grew up in New Jersey. I've been in Florida now going on 8 years. I was here for Ian. I think if you're here for one of those major hurricanes, then you're in your part. And I've been doing field work down here for years. And my uncle has a family home in the Keys. And whenever we go down to the Keys, I grew up learning how to drive a boat on an alpine lake in upstate New York. And now when my family comes down here, I'm the one that has to drive in the Keys because my dad does not understand the landscape under the water. He's like that the seagrass wasn't supposed to be there, and I'm like, it's patchy and it's shallow in spots. You have to know where you're going. It's very different than just like, you know, a cavern filled with water like you get up north. was definitely a concern.
Okay, I'm pretty interested in what you were talking about on the, Calorpa.
Yes.
Back in '67, we had a Hurricane Beulah.
Mhm.
When we went down to Laguna Madre, I took this phycology, algae course. And Calorpa was never in Laguna Madre until this hurricane came. And then in 1973, okay, I remember my phycology teacher saying, they think this Calorpa, which was isolated from the Yucatan, came into the bay from the hurricane, okay, and then started to take over. So even back in this, that far back, there was this idea of a relationship between Calorpa post-hurricane.
Do you remember what species he was referencing?
No,
I'm trying
I'm
to.
sure it's in the literature.
Oh, yes.
So it invaded the whole Laguna Madre area.
So one of the talk tracks that I have been sort of gathering from folks is that, so when I talk about that green filamentous algae, Richard and I are talking about the same species, Calorpa, and the species that it is specifically is fastigiata. There is another form of invasive Calorpa that we started to see some sightings of. With all of our other stuff going on, it's not at the top of the list of things that we're concerned about. It hasn't proliferated to a level where we're worried about it just yet, which is also a Calorpa species, but it's a different, or it's also a Calorpa, the genus Calorpa, but it's a different species. So I don't actually know the origin of this green filamentous algae. I just know that it's appearing with our nutrients.
The Calorpa isop was leaky.
Yes, and that is the species that's invasive, I believe, versus this green filamentous stuff. There was also a debate for a very long time about whether or not it was Lingbia, and for those who are in the loop, Lingbia is it's a freshwater algae, and there was like one study that linked it to some toxicity, which there was doubt about in the scientific community, and created this whole argument amongst the scientists. Who are people too? We fight with each other. It's like really slow form of Facebook, except it's on scientific papers.
That's the Calorpa.
And it's leafy, and one of the questions I've often received is like, can we just take a big net and like scrape up all of the macroalgae that's like sitting on top of the seagrass? And one of the dynamics, I mean, besides like the sheer cost and logistics and what you do with all that algae once you get it, kind of thing, is there is supposed to be some algae in a system, and that algae hosts creatures. And admittedly, we've probably tipped the balance a little bit, but I also know that there's folks at FWC that have said we don't want to scoop it up because, like, in theory, it's part of the natural habitat, and we spend a lot of time trying to correct things that we've mucked up in nature.
Is there any commercial harvesting of it for industrial uses?
So there's not a lot known about that. I can tell you there was a study it was actually out of UF that was investigating sargassum specifically and like how to manage that. And the question specifically was, can we compost it? Right? 'Cause that's the other question is like, what do you do with it? And it turns out sargassum is really high in arsenic. So like so high you wouldn't want to put it on any fruits or vegetables you were going to eat. The other thing that is worth noting, because algae absorbs a lot of stuff from its environment, there's also the potential that it's absorbing, like toxins and heavy metals and like other stuff that's around outside of like just the nutrients that it needs.
So there's multiple things that are causing damage to the seagrass, and do you know where in the list of things climate change falls?
I think climate change is a really big, short answer is no, but I think climate change is a really big topic that causes a lot of regional nuances. So, for example, you could suggest that rising sea levels, you know, I mean, like physically, like, you know, rising sea levels as it gets deeper, less light can get down. That's climate change related. Heat stress is an issue.
Temperature?
Temperature. In general, when you stress, I mean, much the way you guys, you know, anybody ever gets sick after a really big presentation at work? Same thing, right? So if you like have like a couple stressors, and then you know you introduce something like nutrients, it's that last thing that like kicks it over the edge. So my understanding is, particularly in Florida, our concern surrounding seagrass disappearance is primarily nutrients and algae. That being said, I cannot speak for like the rest of the drivers of like the global community, or if there's some sort of sublethal effects of climate change.
Since it's disappearing at a 7% range, globally, you would think that there's something that's the same in all the areas.
Yes. Yeah, Dan just said yes, development. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it just seems like, you know, too many people, too much fertilizers, things being clear cut constantly. And is there any legislation? Is anybody really working hard at really trying to address those are hardcore reasons for all of this? Like, you're not allowed to use a non-organic pesticide or something like that. So people are working on that. I mean, is there hope?
We're here, aren't we? We're here. There is hope. We're here.
This is taking a Jonestown turn.
No Kool-Aid.
I mean, it's hard because when you get into hope, you get into a conversation on political will, right? And one of the things that we hope to do with Eyes on Seagrass is connect people to their environment and generate sort of a ground up approach to advocating for seagrass habitat. So that was actually one of the behaviors I mentioned, you know, not creating propeller scars, looking into less fertilizer. One of the behaviors was advocating for your seagrass habitat in a political setting. That being said, I'm trying to think of you know, I'm in a space, that's part of the reason I like my space. My work is because I'm surrounded by like-minded people who are all trying to do the same thing. And I can tell you about all of the great efforts that they're doing to get people to implement Florida-friendly landscaping, and talking to people about using less fertilizer, and getting creative about not only like talking to individuals, but also certifying, you know, professionals in these skills of using less fertilizer and all of these various principles. That being said, yeah, I mean, I feel like the legislation is something that we're contending with a lot. I believe there's a moratorium on fertilizer ordinances right now.
There's a lot of this.
Yeah, which unfortunately I can't speak to.
Just passed a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
In relation to that, you know, in the Panhandle, if you find a scrub jay, you can't build. So, but why can't you? Any of the seagrass is endangered, or because of population is destroying the seagrass? I mean, somewhere along the line, it might be endangered, and we have to say stop. But
There is, like, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Did you have to do a lot of that work, Liz, or you were specifically with more mangrove stuff? No, I was not looking at you at all. Cool, just totally misunderstood.
No, I did some of that. The problem is that once you get to submerged land, then it falls to FDEP, falls to Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserve. It doesn't, so you can build landside, and unfortunately right now there's no correlation between what you do on the land and how it affects the water.
Cause and effect.
And vice versa. Unless you're talking about mangroves and things like that, because those are again regulated by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. But I believe you can attest to this. It's all kind of goes down to, if you want to impact something, you can offset with mitigation.
So,
Yeah.
permitting for that stuff does exist, like you can't, and in fact, that's one of the issues, I mentioned the A Billion Clams project, that's one of the issues that they have been running into with their permitting, is like they're saying, we wanna restore around seagrass beds, but the Florida Department of Environmental Protection is very protective over their seagrass beds, and rightly so. I would say likely a bigger driver of all of this, as I was talking about that nutrient input, have you guys discussed point and non-point source?
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit. So, point source solution, Piney Point, a great example. That did that. That spilled. We know exactly where that pollution came from. Non-point source is,
Doesn't come out of a pipe.
it doesn't come out of a pipe. And the Peace River is a great example because we're not the only county that it runs through. So it goes up and through the states, and eventually, it makes its way to the water from the canals. It's the fertilizer on people's lawns that's running off into the stormwater system. So non-point source pollution becomes very difficult, and it's also harder to track. You have to put a lot more effort into it, right? It's not putting a radio version of an element in the water and just watching it go. So that's the other thing that makes this complicated is there's so many things that contribute to this. There's, of course, the non-point source solutions, the actual sources of it, but there's also the fact that we're altering our landscape and reducing, we have a lot of permeable surfaces, and we're removing all of our, natural filtration capacities. So, and it's nuanced, and it crosses borders and crosses audiences. And is it the agriculture? Is it Mosaic? Is it us? It's probably everybody, along with sort of the system that we exist in that builds this and clear cuts trees like it's nothing.
On the happy side, Pollyanna is my middle name. So, really. So here's the thing. When I give my talk, either later today, probably next week's talk, I'm going to give you grist for the mill on what's going to be some hope. And it comes by way of Captains for Clean Water just released yesterday a new study, relatively new study. When they say new study, it came out probably 12 weeks ago. But anyhow, the study's called Economic Impacts of Water Quality in Southwest Florida. And it's going to give you information, and I'm going to throw it up there and we're going to talk about it in bullets. It's going to give you the reason to get people's political will to do what needs to be done, because it's going to hit everybody right where it counts, whether you're sitting on your wallet or it's in a bag next to you brought in here. I'm going to go through 5 bullets, and just to cut to the chase, if we have another red tide like in 2018 or 06, 07, they're estimating at today's dollars $40.5 billion it'll cost us if we have another one just like 2018. And it's broken down for what levels of our community, but it affects every one of us. And then that gets the political will going when you talk to your legislators.
On that note, should we do something fun?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is fun.
Let's do something fun and talk about the various methods that we go over. Do you guys? I love a bathroom break. How do enforcement about that? 10 minutes, and then we'll be back. We'll do a brief